Unlike the previous chapter, we had to identify the scientific pitch notation, which I know gave a lot of you some difficulty. With this chapter, it's really just identifying symbols and classifying time signatures. So we're going to start right back in the beginning, the origins of rhythm. Now, this picture of the flute here that you see isn't actually in your textbook, but this is an image of the oldest musical instrument that we have found to date. It dates back to about 42,000 years. They use carbon dating to determine that, but as far as we know, the oldest instruments are made out of bird bone and mammoth ivory. That doesn't mean they were the first musical instruments. The first musical instruments, a lot of people suspect, were probably rhythmic instruments, and from there we started to develop into more melodically based instruments. But they feel that music had served a practical purpose back then, and it was a form of communication. So the different inflections in tone allowed us to communicate with each other, let us know if we were happy about something, unhappy, and then eventually it evolved into language is the idea. They also found that music helps to link people and establish monogamy. That's something they've done quite a bit of studies on. The research for that's actually in the textbook, and I'm not going to go into that. But the main concept here is that music serves a social purpose. It helps to link groups together, helps to link couples together. It has a sort of social glue that sort of bonds societies. And they've also found that there are some monkeys that can actually recognize patterns in music just like humans can. So that's something that they didn't previously believe. They used to believe that animals would just hear different sounds and not necessarily put them together to hear an entire melody. But now they're starting to think that monkeys, at least certain types of monkeys, can actually identify and appreciate melodies as being a cohesive idea. Like, we can put all these different sounds together and say, that sounds like this melody that I know. That sounds like row, row, row your boat, or whatever melody it is that is playing. And we just used to think that animals weren't able to do that. And it's starting to look like monkeys at least are able to. So this is just a bigger picture of that. You see there's 3 holes in there. So essentially, the way wind instruments work is the longer the instrument is, the lower it's going to sound. The shorter it is, the higher the pitch is going to be. So if you were to cover up some of those holes on the end there, then it would actually raise the pitch. And this served obviously as a basis for some of our modern instruments, the concert flute, trombones, trumpets, things like that. So that's just an interesting picture. They found this really pretty recently. It was in the last 20 years, I believe. All right, so this is an important concept. You need to know what a bar line is. The bar line is just this line right down the center of your music. You see how all of your music is divided into these small segments? The dividing line between each measure is called a bar line. So how many measures do I have listed here on the bottom image? 4, right? Pretty simple concept, right? Bar lines are just a way to divide the music up into easily discernible segments of time, so that instead of having just this massive collection of notes, we can divide it into easily identifiable groupings. So this makes it easier for a performer to sight read a piece, also makes it easier to rehearse a piece. I can tell you, go to measure 5, and you guys can count the measures and find out where measure 5 is. It just makes music a lot more comprehensible, a lot more easier to understand. So one concept, which you guys probably already understand, you've got the beat, which is also sometimes known as the pulse. So essentially what the beat is, and it's important for understanding time signatures, but it's a recurring pulse that you feel in the music. The beat isn't how you might use it in common language, where you'd say that song has a really nice beat. You're talking about the rhythm, actually. The beat is just a steady, recurring pulse. It's kind of like your heartbeat. It should, hopefully, beat in steady, regular intervals, right? Same thing with the interval, with a beat. So if you see this melody here, Are You Sleeping? Most of you probably know this. written below that are a series of quarter notes, and what they are representing is the beat in that piece. So when I have you guys count for your rhythm set number 1, you're actually counting the beat. You're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and if it's in 4/4, you start over again. Once you hit 4, you go back to 1. So what that's telling you is that there are 4 beats in each measure when there's a 4/4 time signature. Here, you see a 2/4 time signature. So how many beats would be in each measure? 2. Very simple concept, right? It just starts over every 2 beats. And that's actually important because the first beat of each measure is going to be the one that's typically accented the most heavily. Depending on the time signature, there's actually a hierarchy of how beats are accented. So the first one's always going to be the strongest, unless the composer does something to indicate that he wants a weaker beat there. But when no other indications are there, the first beat will always be the strongest. The second beat will be weaker than the first beat, and then depending on what time signature you're in, each beat in the measure will have a different degree of accent to it. So a 4/4 time signature should really sound, I'm going to try and embellish it to give you an idea, it should really sound like this. With the first beat being really heavy, the second beat will be a little bit lighter, and then they get weaker as they go. But there's actually something more to that, which I'm going to explain a little bit later. So how many measures do we have here? Depends on how you look at it. If you're just counting the measures with the melody, there's only 8 measures. If you want to count the staff below it with the rhythm, then there's 16 measures. If you want to count the rest at the end, then you have 9 measures in the melody and 18 in this entire excerpt. So the concept here is that I want to make sure you guys know what a measure is and how to count them. Because once you know this, we can actually go pretty fast with the performances, the rhythms. We can start learning music a lot more effectively. So the basic concept here is that the notes in that percussion staff that you see on the bottom, they should be tapped at a regular interval. So they should be very steady, and you shouldn't have a variance between the amount of time that each beat is accented. All right, so one way you can do this is if you have a stopwatch, you can just watch the seconds tick by, and each second would be a beat. And then you could just watch that and say, are you sleeping? Are you sleeping? That's one way to figure out the beat. What you'll also see though is that there's different note values here. And most of them, like all the way up until John, all those syllables are 1 beat. When you get to John, suddenly it's worth 2 beats. So you have to hold that note out for 2 beats. We call that note a half note. Got any questions about this? This is pretty clear. So you can actually, with this particular song, you can turn it into a round. So we're going to actually try and sing this real quick. We'll see how this goes. It's a pretty simple melody. And then what we're going to do is once we get to that 8th measure, we're going to go back to the first measure and just loop it over and over again. So let's just sing the melody first, make sure we have it. Here's your starting pitch. 1, 2, ready, go. Are you sleeping? Are you sleeping? Brother John, Brother John. Back to the beginning. Are you sleeping? Okay, good. So now, we're going to make you guys group 1, you in the middle will be group 2, and you guys on the end, there's only like 5 of you, you're going to be group 3. So when you see your number, that's when you're going to start at the beginning of the piece. And what we're going to do here is actually create major and minor chords as we sing. So we'll create harmony. Let's try this and see how it works. So group 1, 2, and then 3. And if some of you guys want to join group 3, that's fine. Help reinforce them. Okay, here we go. Group 1. 1, 2, ready, go.
Are you sleeping?
Group 2.
Are you sleeping?
Group 3.
Brother John, Brother John.
Keep going.
Are you sleeping? Are you sleeping? Brother John, Brother John.
Good. Yeah, we'll do some stuff like that later on, but the basic concept here is that you understand the measures now. You understand what a measure is. I can now tell you, go to measure 8, then go back to measure 1. That's actually really important. It makes it much easier for me to teach you guys music as we go on throughout the semester. But we'll do some more stuff like that, and we'll actually rehearse it to make it sound a little better. All right, so this is what I was talking about earlier. The most accented beat in each measure typically will occur on the first beat. You notice how when you guys are singing, are you sleeping, are, that R, you just naturally accented it. That's because you're kind of tapping into the time signature of the piece. You're just doing that naturally without even thinking. So you can actually have measures that have 128 beats in the measure. And there is a piece, there's quite a few pieces actually that do that. And it's for a very specific reason. But the point with me telling you that there's a piece with 128 beats in the measure is to simply say there's no limit to the number of beats you could have in a measure, but you'd have to have a pretty good reason for it. Generally, it's because the composer is trying to really emphasize that this entire 128 beats is going to be played very loosely, and they don't want really any accents on any particular note. And it's just going to depend on the context of the piece. So you just kind of have to get in the composer's head a little bit to figure out why they would do something like that. It's pretty rare, and it's mainly only seen in modern music, but it does happen. The most common measures you're going to see are going to have 2, 3, or 4 beats. Okay, so that's chapter 9, and that's where we end with that. Now I'm going to go and use the workbook online. Because I really just need some of the images in here from the textbook. Okay, so now we're going to get into the different performance indicators. There are a few different types of symbols that indicate that you need to perform a piece in a different way. We're going to talk about ties, slurs, phrasing, and bowing marks first. They all look the same, but it's the context that tells you what's going on there. So if you look at this first example, it says figure 39. These notes are tied together. It wouldn't be correct to say they're slurred together, they're tied. So a tie happens when you're trying to extend the value of the note by the note that it's tied to. So here, we have a note that's worth 2 beats, this one's worth 1 beat, so now if I were to clap this, I would hold that beat out, or I'd hold those notes out for 3 full beats without re-articulating. And ties are really beneficial for when you have to go over a bar line. If I wanted to keep this in 4/4, I can't just write this as a half note and have the performer know that they should hold that note over the bar line 1 beat. What they do instead is they break it up with a tie. They indicate that this should be played as one continuous note, and then that way you can keep your 4/4 time signature. Because otherwise, if I had 3 beats here and then a half note here, then suddenly the measure has how many beats in it? 5. So we'd have to change the time signature to 5/4, and maybe we don't want to do that. So ties are useful for extending over the bar line. That's probably their most common usage. They can also be used to help show where the beat falls. So if I had a dotted half note here, a little half note here with a dot, then I might not necessarily be able to see clearly where beat 3 is. But this shows the performer, here's beat 1 and 2, this is where beat 3 falls. And that can be useful for a piece that has some other performers accenting on the 3rd beat while maybe performer 1 holds. That can be one way to very clearly show that something else is going to change in the music, but this particular performer that has the ties in his part is going to hold that note over. So ties are just a way to extend the value of the note without using dots or without having to change the time signature. Now a slur, one other thing I'll say about ties, is a very easy to way to identify whether or not a tie is a tie. If it's the same note that's tied, then it's a tie. Ties can only work when it's like a B to a B. A B to a B flat would not be a tie. That would be the next item here, which is a slur. So ties can only connect the same note together. So a slur, that connects different notes. And with a slur, instead of having a separation between the notes that are slurred together, you have a connection between them. So if I were to play this on the piano, you hear how there's a slight separation between the second and the third note. I transposed it a little bit, but that's okay. The point being, with a slur, you're connecting separate notes, and you're doing it in a way to make them sound very legato, is what we call it, very connected and smooth. So the only time you accent or re-articulate in a slur is after the break, after the slur breaks. So here you'd have a slight separation between the D and the C, and then a slight separation between the F and the E. Pretty simple, right? Now phrase marks, they look an awful lot like slurs, but if you see a phrase marking, one way to identify that it's a phrase marking is if it goes over the entire portion of a melody. If the entire melody is under a single, what looks like a slur, it's probably not a slur, it's probably just a phrase marking to show you this is the melody. And that's really important in a lot of modern music, when sometimes the melodies aren't all that clear to a sight reader. Sometimes they get a little bit obscure and a little bit abstract. So you can use phrase markings to indicate how you should think about the melody, how you should think about the contour. It doesn't necessarily mean you should play it connected. You'll have to look at the actual piece and the context to figure out how to perform it, but it does show you that this is the beginning and the ending of a melody. So that's what a phrase marking does. One thing which you're not going to have to worry about in this class, I don't think this is in any of your assignments or quizzes, bowing marks. They look like slurs, but the difference is they have these little symbols above them. It's either like a box here or a V shape. And so these are down bow and up bow symbols. They're used in string music. It tells the violinist when to bring the bow down and when to pick it up, basically. Whether or not they're going to attack the note from the bottom of the bow or from the tip of the bow. So if you're going to tell a performer that you want, a violinist, that you want them to attack it from the tip of the bow, then you use this little V shape. If you're going to ask them to do a down bow, then you're going to use this little box shape. And it gives a different sound. So a down bow is going to sound much more gritty, a lot stronger, more friction to it. And an up bow, where it goes on the tip, is going to be a little bit lighter. It's going to come in more subtly. So it'll be a less perceptible entrance when you use an up bow. But I don't think you have to worry about that for your quiz. All right, so next thing, you need to know about breath marks. A breath mark looks like a little apostrophe. They're usually used in vocal music or wind instrument music when the composer doesn't think that the performer is going to breathe in the right section. Sometimes you don't want to breathe at the top of a phrase, or there is no really great place to breathe in a piece. So the composer will say, if you need to take a breath, this is a place to take it. So this indication here would say that I should sing these first two notes or play them, take a breath, then come back in and sing these two notes. So that's another way of kind of indicating the phrase as well, because when you use a breath mark, it shows you how to articulate that particular melody. And then another type of break is something called a caesura. It's also known as railroad tracks. A lot of musicians will just refer to these as railroad tracks because they kind of look like railroad tracks. And this is different than a break because usually it involves a larger ensemble. You come across this symbol and it means that you need to break until somebody tells you to keep going. So usually that's going to be the conductor. So it'll generally only occur in a large ensemble piece, or it might be the first player in the group, the lead performer. So just know the difference between a breath mark and a caesura. It's subtle, but there is a difference there. So now we're going to get into all the different types of bar lines. There's a lot of different ways to use bar lines in a piece to indicate different things. Generally, when the music's flowing along, you're just going to have single bar lines. Those are the most commonly used bar lines in a piece. And as you can see, there's just a single bar line here between each one of these measures. They're just used to separate each measure from each other. The double bar line, you can see it's 2 bar lines. That usually indicates a new section. So if you see a double bar line, then it indicates to the performer that something's going to change in the music. It might suddenly change to a new key. It might use a different melody. It might be an entirely new section. The composer might just simply be saying, watch out, we're going to have a tempo change here. It's going to speed up or slow down. Double bar lines can be used in a lot of different ways, but they generally mean that some sort of change is coming. My watch is talking to me. All right, so a dashed bar line, that is used in more modern music. You're not going to see this in this class, but you should kind of know what it is. It's a broken bar line. And what it indicates is that the music should be played pretty freely. Instead of having those accents on the first beat, the composer is still trying to use this idea of measures to divide up the music to make it easier for the performer to read. But this doesn't necessarily indicate that this note here in the second measure should be accented really heavily. It's just used when music needs to be played really freely. Generally, it's only going to be used if it's a soloist, because it's pretty difficult to use dash bar lines with an entire ensemble unless they really rehearse a piece over and over again. And there's better ways to indicate a free sounding piece with an ensemble than using dash bar lines. So it's mainly a soloist sort of thing. The final bar line is like a double bar line, but it's got a really thick second bar. And what that means, the piece is over, or the movement's over. So that indicates that you're done, you should stop. If there's another movement or another section that comes afterwards, there will be a rather extended break between the last note before the final bar line and the first note of the new piece. Some of these symbols you already know. Here's a segno sign that just translates to sign. So when you see this, as you've seen in our music, it means that at some point there's going to be a command in the music that tells you to go back to this sign. The coda sign, that indicates where you need to jump to in the music if the music has an extra section at the end. Like in Red River Valley, you have that coda sign, and then there's 2 measures. Those 2 measures would be considered the coda for the piece. So a coda is just sort of the ending of the piece. And a coda sign is useful if you want to repeat the piece exactly, maybe use different lyrics the first and second time, or even third and fourth. And then at the very end of the piece, you just jump to the coda sign, and that's how the piece finishes. So that's why in Red River Valley, I introduced this concept of the coda so that you guys have an idea of how it works. A repeat sign uses what looks like a final bar line, but it's got 2 dots. And usually, you're going to have a forward repeat here at the beginning, and then a backward repeat. And so if I were to perform this, I'd play all the way through to the 3rd measure, And then at the end of the third measure, because there's a repeat sign, I'd go back to the forward repeats. So repeats can be within a piece. They don't have to go back to the beginning of the piece. So when you're sight reading a piece, basically what you're looking for all these different symbols so that when you come across them, you already know what you need to do in a live performance, so that you can just, if you see that backward repeat sign, be aware of where the forward is. And a lot of performers will just kind of circle the forward and the backward repeats and all these different symbols to make it really clear where they are in a piece. All right, so here's some examples. Da capo, that's DC for short. We use the acronym DC. So DC al fine means you go back to the beginning of the piece, because da capo is the head, so the head of the piece, the beginning of the piece. So you go back to the beginning of the piece, you see there's a double bar line here that indicates after this note, I'm going to jump all the way back here, and I'm going to play right through this double bar the second time, and then end at the fine. So it would sound like this if I were to play it on the piano. Jump back to the beginning. Now we go on. And then we're done. That's the fine. That's the end of the piece. So DC doesn't require you to find a sign. Da capo is just the beginning of the piece. Now, da capo al coda, DC al coda, what you'll do is you'll play through. When you see the DC al coda sign, you jump back. You'll play until the coda, and there'll be an indication here that says to coda, or you'll see a coda sign. And then once you hit that, you'll jump forward to the coda sign. So if I were to play this, it would sound like this. Where'd it go? All right. Doesn't really make a whole lot of musical sense, but that is what is written there, so that's how you would play that. And both these are the same way of saying the same. They're two different ways of saying the same thing. Just one uses text that says to the coda. Another uses a coda sign to indicate that's the measure where you jump. And you'll see how there's a double bar line to kind of give the performer a heads up that, hey, there's something happening here. So the dal segno sign, that means you jump back to the actual sign when you see the DS al fine. So I'm going to go ahead and play this example. What we'll do is we'll play all the way through to the E, and then instead of going back to the beginning, I'm going to go back to the sign, and then I'm going to play all the way through until the end. Because it's saying go back to the sign, and then play until the end, the fine sign. It's going to sound a little weird, but that's okay. That's how you would play that excerpt. And again, you can also use DS al coda instead of DS al fine. So with this, you have to go back to the sign, and then when you see the coda sign, you jump to the coda. It's all really confusing. A lot of modern composers will just circumvent this altogether, and they won't use these symbols. You're only going to find this in older music usually, because now they just kind of write everything out. But it used to be that, you know, printing music was a really expensive thing, so you'd use anything you could to kind of save some money on the printing costs. And this actually cuts out quite a few measures by using these signs. Makes it a lot easier for the printing press to deal with it. As if that weren't complicated enough, you also have volta brackets. So volta brackets are also known as first and second endings. Sometimes there's even third endings. When you see a volta bracket, it means that you're going to have a repeat sign somewhere. So here's your forward repeat, here's your backward repeat. So the way you'd play this is you play all the way through to this E, then you repeat back to the beginning, and you'd play your first ending, and then go on to your second ending. So it's just another way of indicating how a piece could be performed. So if I were to play this, I'll go ahead and play it for you so you can see what it sounds like. And then here we skip to the second ending. And then we just keep going throughout the piece. So the first ending, you'll play all the way through, you hit the repeat sign, you go back, you keep playing the first three measures, and then at the start of the first ending, that's when you skip to the second ending. I'm not sure if I said that correctly the first time. So here's an example of what it would sound like if we didn't, or what it would look like if we didn't use volta brackets at all. And this is actually a lot easier for a performer to read, but this uses less ink. So it's kind of a trade-off there. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about octave displacement. If we want a piece to sound higher or lower, we can either write the notes above the staff using ledger lines, or we can use one of these Octave symbols. And there's 8VA, 8VB, 15MA, and 15MB. Those are the four main symbols that we use. So 8VA means ottava alta. It indicates that you need to take this example, these notes, and play them an octave higher than they're actually written. So the first two measures would actually sound like the second two measures. So without the ottavo sign, it would just sound like this. But because we have that sign there, it would sound like this. It would sound an octave higher. Okay? Is that pretty clear? So without that sign, that entire example, but because we have the sign, we take those first two measures up an octave. It sounds an octave higher, and everything under the bracket needs to be taken up the octave. So if you see an A, it means you got to go up an octave. One weird thing about 8VA though is when you see it in the bass clef or it's below the staff, it indicates that you need to take it down an octave. So it's just a convention that people understand. If you're a musician, you just know that if it's written below the music, you got to take it down an octave. So 8VA is kind of tricky in that it could be either an octave up or an octave down, depending on whether it's placed above the staff or below the staff. Usually, and this example here, 8VA below the staff and 8VB, those will be played the exact same way. But usually when you want something to go down an octave, you'll use ottava bassa, which means take it down an octave. So this example here, the first two measures would actually sound like the third and the fourth measure. Now, if you want to take something up 2 octaves, use something called the quindicesima, and this is a 15MA. So these numbers here are telling you how many notes essentially to take it up an octave. So the first 8VA tells you need to count up 8 notes from the starting pitch. The second one tells you it's 15 notes above, which is actually going to be 2 octaves because you don't count the octave twice. So basically, if you count that out on your fingers, you'll figure out how it works. But C to C 2 octaves higher would be how you play this 15MA. So this will sound like this. See how it's separated by 2 full octaves? And then there's also the equivalent 15MB, usually indicates to take it down 2 octaves. That usually confuses people a lot. They think, well, 8 times 2 is 16, so why isn't it 16? It's actually not how it works out with octaves though. And even some musicians will incorrectly write 16 MA or 16 MB, but the correct symbol is 15 MA. If you were to write 16, it'd be up 2 octaves plus 1 more pitch. So this C would actually be a D. So the number does matter, but any performer who sees 16 MA will assume they just meant 2 octaves above, because 16 MA just doesn't exist. We don't use that. There's another way to write an entire piece an octave higher or lower. If you put a little 8 beneath the clef in the treble clef, it indicates that you need to take everything up 1 octave. If you put a 15 below the treble clef, it indicates you need to take it up 2 octaves. In the bass clef, you go the opposite direction. You go down instead of up. So if you see an 8 underneath the bass clef, it means it's going to be played down an octave. A 15, everything will be played down 2 octaves. And that would be if you have an instrument that plays really low, like the tuba, and you want them to play the entire piece in a really low register, and you don't want to either use a bunch of ledger lines or use the 15 MA or 8 VB symbols. So the last thing in this particular chapter are dynamic markings. This tells you basically how loud or how soft a piece should be performed. So right here, mezzo piano, mezzo forte. Mezzo means medium. Piano means soft. Forte means loud. So this translates to medium soft, and this is medium loud. These are kind of right about where most people will sing or perform. And then when you go to the right, it just gets louder. If you go to the left, it gets quieter. This quadruple piano here is actually a very, very quiet entrance, almost imperceptible. The most common signs that you're going to see are between pianissimo and fortissimo. You generally don't see a triple forte or quadruple forte, but they can occur in music. So just know for your assignments, I believe one of your assignments is dynamic markings. Just know how all these symbols, what they indicate, how loud or soft you should be performing a section based on the symbol. All right. This isn't too bad of a chapter. It's pretty simple. Basically what I want you to see here, the note values we're going to use in this class, you've got a whole note, a half note, quarter note, an eighth. We're not really going to get into 16th notes. But all these note values are based on the whole note. So a half note is worth half the value of a whole note. A quarter note is worth a quarter of the value of a whole note. An eighth note is worth an eighth of the value of a whole note. So in the time it takes you to play one whole note, you can play 2 half notes, you can play 4 quarter notes, you can play 8 eighth notes, you could play 16 16th notes, you could play 128 notes. It goes all the way down to, you can have 256 notes, 512. I mean, it keeps going. But if you're going to see a rhythm that uses like 256 notes, then they're going to be probably performed very, very slowly. Generally, that doesn't, the note value doesn't indicate how fast the piece is. That's what the tempo does. And the way we indicate these is we've got the whole note that doesn't have any flags or stems. So you notice that the 8th note, 16th, and 32nd, they have this little flag coming off the side of them. Each flag that you add on doubles the note value. It increases it by twice the speed. So you start out with a stem on what looks like a whole note, and that cuts the value in half, gives you your half note. For the quarter note, you fill in the little circle in the middle. That gives you your quarter note. You keep the single stem. For the 8th note, you just add 1 flag to the quarter note. For the 16th, you add 2 flags. 32nd, you add 3. If you had 64th notes, you'd add 4. 128th notes, you'd add 5. And you can actually just keep adding stems. And what will happen is you'll have to make this stem longer in the staff system to accommodate all the flags. So here, for every note value, there's also a rest. The whole note rest, it sits right below the fourth line of the staff system. And the way I always thought of it is it was heavy, so it's kind of sinking down below the staff. The half note is lighter, but it occurs on the third line of the staff system and it goes above the staff. So what you're seeing here with this little line, that's actually a staff line. So when you see it in an actual piece of music, you're just going to see a little square. You're not going to see this little staff line unless there's no staff to be seen. Sometimes that'll happen in percussion music. So basically the way this table works is you can look at the name of the note, see how many beats it's worth. So a whole note, you've got a whole note or a whole rest. Here's a whole note, here's a whole rest, it's worth 4 beats. Half note, here's a half note, here's a half rest, it's worth 2 beats. So this is just to help you with your quiz if you have any trouble. And on the note equation quiz, basically what it does is it has a whole bunch of note values that you have to add up. So you might have a whole note and a half note, and you have to add those two together. So how much is a whole note plus a half note? Well, you go over here and you look at your table. 4 plus 2 is 6. So that's your answer. If you had a whole note plus a whole rest plus a half note, then you'd have to take 4 plus 4 plus 2. So then you'd have 10. So that would be the answer you put in for that particular one. So what that little assignment's doing is helping you to learn the note values for these different notes and rests. So this is what a whole note looks like on the staff. It could be on any staff line as you've seen in our music. The whole rest though, as I said, it falls below the fourth line. And then I'm going to scroll down and let you see the half note. Half note comes above the third line. So if you were to compare them, you've got one whole rest for the entire measure, and then you need 2 half rests if you wanted to indicate rest for the entire measure. And you see the whole rest comes down below the fourth line, half rest comes above. One other way that you can indicate 8th notes and 16th notes is you can beam them together. And so this particular passage has them beamed in groups of 4. And that's indicating where the first beat is, and then there's the third beat. So it helps a performer more quickly see what note they're dealing with and where the beat falls in a piece. Since it's beamed like this in groups of 4, it's going to indicate that this is probably a pretty fast passage. If they were beamed in groups of 2, that would show the individual beat 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you'd have a little break here between the second and third 8th note. And the way you do this for 16th notes is you just add another bar line underneath it. For 32nd notes, you'd have 3 of these beams. And for 64th notes, you'd have 4 beams. Is that confusing to anybody? So we've kind of gone over this. This just shows you that in a 4/4 time signature, you count 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see if we need to talk about anything else here. You can kind of go over this, but this is what I was talking about. It shows you how you can actually write 8th notes in 3 different ways. You can write them just with their flags and separate them. And if I saw this in a piece, I'd probably want to play with a slight separation between each note, because that kind of indicates that's what they're looking for. You can separate them by the beat, or you can separate them by half the measure, or whatever you need to do to indicate where the beat falls in that particular piece. So there's many ways to beam notes. It just depends on the piece and what they're trying to accomplish. One thing that I am going to talk about now is we've only been talking about the division of the beat when it falls on one of the main beats. When you go below the main beat, we call that a subdivision. So here, 8th notes are subdivided. So the way we count those is if we were to write it out in our music, we'd write a plus sign, but we don't say 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus. That plus sign represents the word and. So you'd count this by saying first you could just start by counting the main beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you could subdivide by saying 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So that helps you identify by using the beat and the pulse for the piece, it lets you learn how you can count some of these more complex subdivided rhythms. And we'll get into that when we get into rhythm set number 3. I'll show you how that actually works. So just for reference right now, for 16th notes, you've still got the 8th note here. The 8th note would fall here, 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 and here. And you see it says 1 and 2 and. That indicates where the 8th note would fall in this piece. But then you also have 16th notes. So to do that, the first 16th note is going to be an E. The last 16th note is going to be an A. So we count this 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, 4 E and a. So what you're doing is you're using the main pulse of the piece and then subdividing to keep an even tempo so you can figure out how each rhythm is performed. And if this is at all confusing, it'll become more clear as we start doing more of the exercises in class. So here's just an example of all the different notes. You see here you've got a 256 note rest. That's what it'll look like. You have all these little bulbs on the end of it. So dotted note values, I think you guys kind of understand this concept. A dotted note value is basically another way of writing a tie without having to use the tie. So if you put a dot on the end of any note, it cuts the value of that note in half and then adds it to the original note value. So with a dotted half note, we have a total of 3 beats because half of a half note is a quarter note. So you take the half note plus a quarter note to get 3 beats. Here, you've got a dotted quarter note. So half of a quarter note is an 8th note. So you take the quarter note plus the 8th note to get 1.5 beats. So you can use multiple dots. And what happens is every dot you add, it takes the note value that you cut in half, it cuts it in half again, and adds it to the end. So here's an example of that. So the double dotted half note. Well, a dotted half note is a half note plus a quarter note. The next dot will take the quarter note, cut it in half, it gives you an 8th note, and then it adds it on to the end of that half note. So this is actually worth, you've got 3.5 beats. Does that make sense? Kind of confusing, you don't see it too often, but this is just an example. You can have triple dotted notes. I don't think I've ever seen that. But you could theoretically have a triple dotted note. And this is just to kind of help send this point home on how this dot system works. The way that would work is you have your half note, cut it in half, get a quarter note, cut the quarter note in half, get an 8th note, cut the 8th note in half, you get a 16th note, add them all together, and that is your triple dotted half note. So here's just an example of how you might, in a piece, count your dotted note values. So if I want to learn how to count this, I could take it really slowly, keep my 8th note beat steady, my subdivision of the 8th note steady, and then I could write in 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and to indicate where I should clap each particular note. So if I were to play this, I'd say 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 as you get better, you don't need to count them out, but it's useful to keep that steady beat going when you're initially trying to learn the rhythm to make sure that you learn it correctly. Eventually you can just play it. But when you're learning a piece, it's important to understand the concept of subdivisions because sometimes these get really complicated. And if you map everything out using the math to begin with, it makes it easier to perform all this. The final thing is when you want to divide a piece into tuplets. So here you've got 3 notes with a little 3 underneath them, and you see there's a beam. What this indicates is that these three notes should be played over the value of what would be 2/8 notes combined. So 2/8 notes combined is one beat. So a tuplet just adds one more beat into that, one more note into that single beat, and it spaces them equally. So if my beat is 1, 2, 3, 4, the tuplets, 8th note tuplets would be, so 1, 2, 3, 4. And then here you've got quarter note triplets. So you take the lowest value of that triplet, you multiply it times 2, and then you space all three notes over that distance. So in this case, since I have 3 quarter note triplets, 2 quarter notes is a half note, so I need to play all 3 notes over the span of what would normally be 2 beats. So it gives you kind of an uneven feel for the piece. And here you've got half note triplets. 2 half notes is a whole note, so that means I need to play 3 of these over the course of 4 beats. And here's just some more examples. All right, there's 2 different ways you can count those. So now we're almost done. When you see a time signature, those are the 2 numbers at the beginning of the piece. These numbers indicate how the beat should fall in the music and which note is going to be considered a beat. Because usually the quarter note is going to be the beat in a piece of music, but the 8th note could be the beat, or the 16th note could be counted as a beat. And if you have an 8th note as a beat, that means every time you see an 8th note, the first 8th note would be 1, the second 8th note would be 2. So that just changes how fast a piece is actually performed. So basically what you need to know here is that these are kind of fractions. So if you take off the top number and you just put a 1 there, you got 1 quarter. So what that tells you is that the top number tells you how many beats there are in the measure. So in this case, there's 4 beats in the measure, which you've seen in our music. And the bottom note, when you turn the top number into a fraction, you make it a 1, it tells you that the quarter note gets 1 beat. So anytime you see a quarter note, you'd hold it for a full beat. These are all quarter notes, if that's the beat. The 4/4 time signature can also be written as a C, which just means common time, because it's used so commonly. Cut time will look a lot like 4/4, but the number on top, the 2, indicates there's 2 beats in the measure. And the 2 on the bottom, remember you cut this 2 off the top, you make it a 1, that's 1/2, indicates that the half note is going to be worth 1 beat. So in a 2/2 time signature, every time I see a half note, if this is a beat, these are all half notes. And now quarter notes are no longer the beat, they're twice as fast. So that's how that works. And then here's a symbol that can be used to indicate cut time. So with 4/4, you've got this symbol. With 2/2, it's commonly written just with a C with a line through it. So just a few more examples. 2/4 time, the 2 indicates 2 beats in the measure. The 4 indicates the quarter note's going to be worth 1 beat. So all the quarter notes you see are going to be 1 beat, and all the other note values are going to be in relation to that quarter note. 6/8 time is a little bit weird because of something I'm going to get into. Probably going to have to be on Thursday, or I'll probably just post something online for you guys. But the 6 on top actually indicates that, that's a typo, but it actually indicates there's 6 beats in the measure. The 8 on the bottom represents 1/8 of a whole note, so it indicates that the 8th note's worth 1 beat. But that's not usually how we count 6/8 time signatures, and that's something I'm going to have to get into a little bit later. So here's what I was talking about with the accents. In 3/4 time, the accent structure, the first beat is going to be strong, the next 2 will be weak. So it's kind of like a dance. In 4/4 time, the first beat's the strongest. The third beat is going to be the third, that's actually supposed to be the second strongest. There's another typo. The third beat, oh no, we did this right. So the first beat's the strongest, the third beat is the second strongest, the second beat is the third strongest, and the fourth beat would be the weakest. I thought this would be lined up first, second, third, fourth, but it is written correctly, so we're okay there. So 2/2 time and 2/4 time is just a strong beat structure. And in 6/8 time, we actually use a triplet fill. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you've got strong, weak, weak, medium, weak, weak. So the fourth beat is going to be the second strongest beat in a 6/8 time signature. In a 9/8, you've got the first beat that's the strongest, the fourth beat is going to be a medium beat, and the seventh beat will also have a medium accent. So I'm going to sum up how you classify time signatures very quickly. There are 3 types of time signatures. You have simple, you have compound, and you have complex. Complex time signatures are basically anything that doesn't fall into the category of simple or compound. A simple time signature is very simply, if you scroll down, here's how you figure them out. If the top number of the time signature is a 2, 3, or a 4, we call it simple time. If the top number of a time signature is 6, 9, or 12, it's compound. If it's anything else, it's complex. So that's how you do your assignment. You can read all this and learn more about it, but the important thing to pass your assignment is to know that if there's a 2, 3, or 4 on top, it's simple. If there is a 6, 9, or 12, it's compound. And if there is anything other than a 2, 3, 4, 6, 9, or 12, it's complex. So that's all